Ready to dig a little deeper? Ready to move into a space that involves more challenge and often opens more questions than answers? Let's talk about how to love our enemies.
Welcome to the Sifted Wheat Podcast with Leslie Lamb, a counselor by profession, a minister of truth, and a lover of people. This is a safe place where she sets a path for others to learn how to move through hard seasons with confidence and grace, encouraging your faith, empowering your choices, and challenging your perceptions through the Word, the wisdom from years of counseling others, and her own experience of being sifted. Here's Leslie.
I love how when Jesus has a conversation about what his audience would have encountered as a story involving their enemies, he flips it on its head and makes that person a neighbor. You know the story? It's in Luke 10, where a Jewish man was left lying on the side of the road, bleeding and dying. A Levite and a priest pass him, and due to their adherence to the law and obedience, they pass by, refusing to dirty themselves to show mercy to one of their own. Then Jesus says, a Samaritan man saw him and took pity on him. This would have made the crowd cringe. A what? A who? But Jesus continued and tells of the concerning mercy and care the man displays towards his enemy, nursing his wounds, purchasing a place to rest and heal, and making provision for even his future needs. And then he asked, who is the neighbor? The man, an expert in the law, it tells us, that would have adhered to the obedience of the priest and Levite and seen them justified in their choices, he can't even say the Samaritan. So he responds, the one who had mercy. And Jesus says, go and do likewise. In other words, be like the Samaritan. I am sure that left a bad taste in their mouths. After all, the man was addressing Jesus in order to make himself feel better. And the response was a conversation about what it really means to love your neighbor as yourself. First of all, as Jesus points out, you can't see them as your enemies. We live in a culture that loves to present enemies to us, that fuels a dividing line and pits us against them. But Jesus showed up in so many spaces and basically said, be sure you don't draw that line on the wrong side. Psalm 19:13 says, keep me from presumptuous sins. I don't know about you, but I need that reminder from time to time. We can feel justified in our anger and our offenses. We can feel validated in reacting in our feelings and judging others as being right or wrong, evil or good. But if we aren't careful, we can be guilty of disobedience by not showing mercy. Remember 2020? Remember the anger and the frustration, the punches that were thrown and the names called and the names not said? I do. I would see all that clickbait on my phone and I would get so riled about political propaganda and conspiracy theories. And I would find myself wanting to say all the things about all the things. But then I heard the Lord say, Leslie, be careful. Be slow to speak. Be slow to get angry. Don't align with lies, but live in my truth. Be holy or separate as I am holy. And of course, I'm a little sassy. So I was like, but God, they're lying. They're making these accusations and creating division and calling it justice. And he replied, are you absolutely sure you're seeing the full picture? Don't you love it how he answers us with questions? As a counselor, I actually get that. If I just tell my client something, it only resonates as deeply as the message. But if I engage my client to think, to critically think through what they believe or what they feel, it's going to work deeper in their mind to bring awareness. Which is why when Jesus started the conversation with the expert of the law, he asked a question, what is written? And added, how do you read it? And then he led him down a path of understanding to make him aware that how he read it and what it was saying might be two very different things. That's what he was doing with me in 2020. And the answer was similar. As convinced as I was, as much as I felt and wanted to say it, as much as I was convinced that I was aligned with the truth in his word, it still included my opinion and my perception. And I could not be 100% sure that I was reading it in the right way to see and to make a right judgment. So I didn't engage my emotions to react and do so quickly. I didn't push my opinions or argue with others' opinions on social media. I didn't let myself get offended as easily. And when I did, I tried to repair and repent, not perfectly, but consistently. And in so doing, I realized I have one enemy, and he can show up anywhere and lie to us, even subtly. Paul tells us, for our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. That's in Ephesians 6:12. I have to remind myself of that every day. I also have to remind myself that when I'm not careful, even if I'm not aware, the enemy can be using me, making me someone's enemy and them mine. How? Well, mostly by thinking too much of myself and not enough about God and his higher vantage point. We've all heard some semblance of this statement. The problem Susie has with Sally has more to do with Susie than it does Sally. In other words, our problems with other people have more to do with the insecurities and pride working in us than they do with the other person. Who I view as my enemy has more to do with my feelings than it does their actual choices. If I'm taking it personally, that's my choice. That person could mean it offensively, but if I receive it offensively, then that also becomes my choice. They can reject me, but if I make that feel like the worst thing ever and then start to judge and persecute them, I actually hurt myself more than the rejection should have had the power to affect me. If I sit in anger and bitterness and seek to punish someone for what they did to me, that's actually a judgment against me. And he or she is just living their lives unaffected while I'm struggling with chronic pain and crippling anxiety. This leaves me feeling smaller and smaller and less significant, and those who love me and see me feel less and less important because they're showing up, but I'm so focused on my enemy that I can't even see them clearly. Does that sound familiar? You can't see me, but I'm raising my hand because I have been there way too many times to count. And who actually wins? Not them, the enemy of my soul, who's slowly replacing an identity of security and belonging with one of insecurity and fear, and no doubt convincing me to make destructive choices in the process. The flesh and blood, unaware and careless, the spiritual rubbing his hands and salivating because I'm playing right into his hands. So how do I love my enemies? First of all, I have to realize who my real enemy is. Now, let me be clear. I'm not saying your enemy is possessed of the devil. Nope. I'm saying that however and whenever the enemy has chosen to interrupt your life with whoever. And as a child of God, you can choose to take back that territory and evict him from that space. The truth is, most people don't have a clear understanding of the effect of their choices. I mean, they can be mean and cruel and aggressive, but they really can't determine the level of injury it creates to the soul. When Jesus was surrounded by the mockers and those condemning him and literally stretching his body tightly against splintering boards, he didn't scream out, "You're going to pay for this. My Father will punish you for your choices. You're evil." No. He said with each crucifying wound, "Father, forgive them. They know not what they do." And they didn't. Not really. They knew what they were physically doing, but spiritually, they had no idea what was being done in that moment. Probably a good thing, because I don't think we'd be having this conversation if they did. But Jesus knew. As he looked the centurions in the face and received the jeers and the taunts of the crowd, You're not my enemy. He knew. But in this moment, I'm taking power into my own hands so that you might see and know who the real enemy is and that I've conquered him. So how do I love my enemies? Do I forgive them? I need to. Not because they haven't offended me or hurt me or that they deserve to get away with it, but because forgiveness is about releasing them from my life and freeing me up to see myself and them more clearly. It's not easy to love our enemies. Jesus knows that, which is why he painted a picture of a neighbor instead. He also challenged the same issue in Luke 6 when he said, if you only love those who are good to you, what credit is that? Instead, I say, love your enemies. And then he goes on to say that in so doing, you look most like your Father in heaven who is kind to those who do evil. What? Why? Because Jesus saw the full picture. He read it rightly. He responded against the wickedness with love and kindness. And I assure you, our real enemy cringed. And the goodness of God through his son Jesus is this. He didn't just say the words and expect others to live them out. He acted on those words over and over. And those who followed him saw that and trusted him all the more. Even the wicked were impacted and many redeemed. So how do you love your enemies? First, we need to consider the whole story, not just what you see and feel, but we need to trust that there might be a bigger perspective. Maybe we need to zoom out and we need to consider, who is my enemy? Or is it better if I see this person as a neighbor? Second, ultimately, our enemy isn't flesh and blood, but spiritual. And we need to remind ourselves of that regularly in order to see people and our circumstances more clearly. Thirdly, we need to consider the strategy of our true enemy and affecting our lives, and we need to learn how to resist him. If you ever ask yourself who benefits from this division or anger, that's a great question that can clear some of that up pretty quickly. The fourth thing that we need to do, and maybe the hardest, is we need to forgive as we've been forgiven. What are the steps that you need to take to do that? Well, that's honestly between you and God. He gets that it's hard and weighty, and I'm not here to tell you what that needs to look like and sound like, but I can tell you what it will eventually feel like, and that's freedom. So, what steps do you need to take this week to love your enemy? Where do you need to read it right or engage it better? Where do you need to forgive and or apologize? Listen, I know it's easier said than done, but anything worth doing should be difficult. Remember, love liberates. Loving your enemy liberates you from fear, insecurity, anger, grief, and bitterness. And God willing, one day it could liberate them too. Wouldn't that make our enemy truly mad? More so, wouldn't that glorify our Father and represent him more clearly? Jesus said it does, and that's my motivation. So this week, let's do the work to rename our enemy our neighbor, to start to engage them in love, because division is the work of the enemy, and unity is the work of the kingdom of God, which brings us to another topic. And I know this might crush some toes and tighten some glutes, but what if your enemy is the church? Yeah, we have to go there. Because right now, the enemy of our soul is trying to confuse her identity with anything and everything, so we will abandon her. So we have to reveal his strategy, and we have to reclaim the beauty in the bride of Christ. So I've decided that we're going to talk about that. We have to talk about who she actually is and how to love her next.